Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Racial Equity and Food Justice Training. This training has been made possible by the Michigan Local Food Council Network and the Center for Regional Food Systems. This training is part of an ongoing commitment by the Michigan Local Food Council Network to make diversity, equity, and inclusion the foundation of their work. And even more so, this training is happening because the network requested it. We continue to strive to offer resources that are responsive and relevant to everyone in the network. Whether you are new, rejoining, or moving to a different space within your work. Again, my name is Shiloh Maples. During the first session, we began developing a common language of what race and racism is, discussed the different levels of oppression and power structures. We also talked about how those with the most power and privilege are really in a good position to be allies and what allyship looks like. We discussed some of the social, political, and economic factors that have created the inequities and disparities experienced by Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. We also started talking about the two broad groups that our work can fall into, the first being direct services and programs, and the second group being policy, systems, and environmental level changes. During part 2 of this training, we will discuss food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. We will begin to explore concepts of power and some ways we can shift power to create a more equitable food system. When we think about the term food justice, a term that often arises is food deserts. We may also hear another term, food apartheid. Let's take a few minutes to really look at what the difference is between those two terms, because the language that we use to talk about inequities shapes the way we think about the issues, strategize around them, and see the solutions to the issues themselves. First, let's look at the term food desert. When people imagine a food desert, what often comes to mind is a barren or desolate landscape with no food. People think of a literal desert. However, deserts are actually landscapes that have an abundance of food for those that know where to find it. Some of my colleagues and friends in the Southwest who are pictured there know that there is abundance of food in the desert. Also, using the term food desert kind of frames food insecurity as kind of a passive or natural event, that it's just the nature of the environment to be void of food. This term positions more markets or large corporations as solutions to the problem of food insecurity. However, this is not an accurate depiction of why people and communities cannot access food, nor does it get at the root causes of these issues. The term food apartheid looks at the whole food system along with race, geography, economics, and power relationships. The term apartheid itself refers to a legal system of discrimination based on race. I think people are most familiar with this term when they think about the history of South Africa, but we can see examples of this in the United States with Jim Crow laws. So when you say food apartheid, you get at the root causes of some of the problems in the food system. In the U.S. society, things like redlining or the different laws that prevent people from owning land have created systematic ways that resources are distributed differently based on race, creating intergenerational wealth and poverty. Over time, these policies and others have created unhealthy food environments around communities of color and low-income communities, leading to all sorts of social, economic, and health disparities. This term, food apartheid, positions access to land, livable wages, and community ownership as solutions to hunger. So if we're looking to address disparities in the food system and broader society, we have to acknowledge the inequitable or unfair power relationships and systems that are at the root cause of the issues. Briefly, I want to highlight the person that coined the term food apartheid, Karen Washington. She is one of the co-founders of Rise and Root Farm, a farm in Orange County, New York, that is cooperatively run and woman-led. Karen brought to the national dialogue a lot of awareness that the food system didn't just kind of happen this way, but that it's a result of all the different policies and legal systems of discrimination. Next, we're going to talk deeper about the different movements or approaches to these underlying issues. More specifically, we're going to look at the distinctions between food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. The reference for this table is at the end of the slide, so you'll have access to the full article that it's from, but I want to show part of this table from Food First, which shows the distinction between the different food movements. Looking at food security first, in the green column, this really comes from a community development perspective. Solutions are typically framed as market-led reform, focusing on increasing food production and food aid. The political orientation is focused on reforming the current system. Some of the main institutions that are engaged in this food security work include the World Food Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization through the UN, the USDA, food banks, and food aid programs. Now looking at the middle purplish column at food justice movements and organizations, they come from an empowerment perspective and are often aimed at investing in underserved communities, solidarity economies, more equitable land, and food access. Typically, food justice organizations approach the food crisis advocating for the right to healthy, culturally appropriate food. Their politics are seen as progressive. Some of the main institutions that are engaged in food justice work are some slow food chapters, some food policy councils, and many farm worker and labor organizations. The orange or far right column looks at food sovereignty. This movement is focused on entitlements or a rights-based perspective. Food sovereignty groups typically are aimed at dismantling inequitable power dynamics, such as dismantling the corporate monopoly and big ag. They often are working towards redistributive land justice, community rights to water and seed, and are focused on regionally or locally based food systems. A big part of food sovereignty is democratically or locally controlled decisions about the food system. The food sovereignty movement approaches the food crisis advocating for the human rights to food sovereignty. That is, the inherent right that everyday people and communities have to make decisions about their food system, not corporations and special interests. The politics are much more radical. Some of the organizations or main institutions that are engaged in food security include the Peasant Farm Worker Movement throughout Latin America, International Planning Committee on Food Sovereignty. I think that there's a lot of overlap between food justice and food sovereignty. Just some organizations are focused more on the right to culturally appropriate food, and some are focused on the right to govern their food systems. No matter where your daily work is positioned, we can build alliances between these different movements and work together to create transformational change while also meeting people's immediate needs. Now we're going to shift to talk more specifically about power. What is it? Where does it come from? And how do we share power? By definition, power is the ability to act or have influence over others. There are a lot of different sources and forms of power, so let's do a quick overview of some of these. Positional power, sometimes called legitimate power, is when someone has a position of leadership or decision-making. We might call this authority granted by an official position that someone holds. Power can also be seen in connections, so those networks and relationships that people have. There is power in mobilizing large numbers of people. There's also a power in resources or rewards. There are a lot of different ways that this kind of power can manifest. It can be money or other resources. It could even be, if someone has a certain award or recognition that has brought them influence. Personal traits can be a form or source of power. So if we think about charisma or charm or other characteristics that foster respect and loyalty. Having expertise is a form of power, so those knowledge, skills, talent. Information is power. so the ability to either channel or withhold information. One negative form of power that we do not recommend, but we have to at least acknowledge, is coercion, which can be manipulation or intimidation. Are there any other forms of power that you would add to the list? Consider the organizations or groups that you work in. What sources of power do people bring to the work? What power and power structures have you inherited either because of a social identity or maybe a position within an organization? What are some ways that you or your organization could share some of that power? How might our role, position, or work itself change if we focus on shifting power? Next, we're going to introduce a framework called Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation. This is a tool that can be used to really look at different types of community engagement and ownership. Starting at the lower rungs of the ladder, there are examples of non-participation, and as we move up the rungs, there is a greater degree of power sharing. At the bottom, we see manipulation and therapy, and both are non-participatory. These aim at curing or educating participants. The plan is already formed, and the goal is to achieve buy-in or public support. If we look at the next couple of rungs to informing, this is when stakeholders are kept informed of what's going on, but are not offered the opportunity to contribute. Communication is one way, and there's no channel for feedback. Consultation is when stakeholders have an active role in sharing their opinions and ideas, but final decisions remain with the facilitators. There is two-way communication present. This section of the ladder is where we see tokenism. In these situations, you might see people being handpicked or deemed worthy to participate in certain committees. This allows citizens to advise or be a part of planning, but the power really is retained by certain people. People with power still retain the right to judge the legitimacy or feasibility of the information that they get from community members. The next rung of the ladder is partnership. This is when stakeholders have direct involvement in the decision-making process and action, and each stakeholder has a clear role, set of responsibilities, and powers. At the delegation rung of the ladder, here the goal is likely to have been set by facilitators, but the resources and responsibility for solving the problem are passed to the stakeholders. So there are clear lines of accountability, and citizens hold a clear majority of seats on committees with delegated powers to make decisions. At this point, the public now has the power to ensure accountability of the programming and services provided to them. The top rung of the ladder is citizen control. This is when the idea for a project or initiative starts with community stakeholders. They may come to facilitators for advice, discussion, and support, but facilitators do not direct citizens. Citizens handle the entire tasks of planning, policy making, and managing a project. There are no intermediaries between the community and the source of the funds. Again, this model is a tool that you can use to determine the degree of power sharing that is or isn't happening in your work now, but you can also have conversations about where on the ladder you want your work to be. The next thing we want to share is a tool or exercise called stakeholder mapping. If you look at this graph, on the y-axis we have stakeholder power. On the x-axis is stakeholder interest. So for this exercise, you would place each different stakeholder or stakeholder group on the graph according to their perceived power and interest. Take a few minutes to consider the dots already placed on the graph. Who might these different stakeholders be? How might you interact with them differently? Who might be stakeholder A? They have a fair amount of power and interest in the issue. They could be a funder or another organization whose mission overlaps with yours. And they could be a really easy and powerful ally to connect with. Who might be stakeholder B? Perhaps they are a community member or neighborhood resident. They might have less power, but a lot more interest in the issues. They may not have many resources, connections, or positional power, but are nonetheless important to the cause. What about stakeholder C? They could be a local business leader or another community leader who has a lot of power, but isn't directly involved in the issues you're working on. Maybe they're not as knowledgeable or don't have as much personal interests or really haven't been bought in or invested in the work yet. It might take a little bit of relationship building to get them more invested and understand that your priorities are much more aligned. What about stakeholder D? This is someone with less power and less interest. Who might this be? Perhaps somebody who's not yet aware of the issues right now. Maybe they haven't made the same connection or seen the relevance to their own life yet. How would you approach or work with a stakeholder? Definitely some relationship building and maybe information sharing is necessary. Or maybe this person feels disenfranchised or disillusioned with what's happening. They may feel pretty apathetic towards the issues. How might you approach interactions with them then? How might you be able to use stakeholder mapping in your groups or organizations? Now let's look at some additional examples of power sharing. In the realm of building community, we can see power sharing as authentic relationships and engagement, transparent communication and information sharing, so being really thoughtful in the way you make your decision-making process clear and transparent, who's allowed to be in the room during deliberations, how you follow up to share information or provide a report back to community afterwards, or is that information being kept among a small group? Power sharing can be a simple but powerful act of facilitating connections and broadening networks. The second column or group here is about recognizing community power. This includes assessing or identifying the existing resources, assets, and skills in a community. And it's also about determining what you and your organization can do to shift power and resources. The third column of examples is focused on mobilizing resources. Perhaps that's adapting your decision-making process to make it more inclusive or so that people's decisions actually have some weight in the outcome. Or providing training to community partners outside of your organization. This could look like reserving a few seats at a training or waiving registration fees. If your organization has certain expertise, skills, or knowledge, are you making those skills and knowledge available to community? How are you supporting the resource building of your partners? This might look like assisting with grant writing or offering fiscal sponsorship to entities that do not have nonprofit status. Lastly, how might you be able to compensate people for their time and effort? Many people engaged in social change work are doing so on a volunteer basis or in unpaid community roles, and we know that time and money are important but limited resources for us all. It is a privilege in itself to have time to volunteer, attend committee meetings, and be engaged. And too often, people of color are asked to serve on committees and to do different types of labor, but are not fairly compensated for that labor. This eats away at the resources and reserves that they have as an individual. We recognize that there are often different policies and barriers to compensating people financially, but compensation can look many different ways. I invite you to think creatively. Can you provide a meal at meetings? Can childcare be offered on site? Can you offer gas cards or bus tokens? How can you show that you value their time and contributions? Lastly, one example that I didn't put on here, but it is definitely a part of power sharing, is more internal work we can do as individuals. Letting go of privilege, of ego, of wanting recognition. It can feel good to be in charge of a project or to claim success or be in positions of decision making, but there is power in doing that. We have to be reflective and willing to give up some of our own privilege and power. Now we're going to introduce this idea of an equity action project or initiative. An equity action project is an opportunity that you see to address inequities in the food system. An accompanied handout is available to guide you through the major phases of an equity action project, and over time we intend on adding additional materials to support this work, but at this time I'm going to give a very brief overview. First, identify a food systems issue or an inequity that you want to address. Take some time to do some self-education on any of the social, health, or other disparities and inequities that are at the root cause of this issue. Do some writing to articulate what those negative outcomes are related to this particular issue. Take some time to learn about some of the social, political, and historic factors that contribute to the problem. Next, identify people or groups that are already engaged in this work. You don't want to reinvent the wheel or duplicate efforts, and I want to encourage you to consider how you can show up in allyship to BIPOC leaders who are already engaged in this work. Take some time to consider what potential barriers may arise and how you might navigate those. This concludes our racial equity and food justice training. We have some accompanying handouts and exercises to continue supporting your learning and your food systems work. Thank you everyone for your participation in this training and in the Michigan Local Food Council Network.